As the golden hues of the Los Angeles sunset stretched across the sky, Keanu Reeves approached the towering gates of his new residence, a high-end condominium tucked away in an exclusive neighborhood. The soft hum of his Norton Commando 961 echoed against the ivy-covered walls as he parked beside the security booth, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the world, yet remained humble in his ways. Dressed casually, his demeanor was relaxed. But as soon as he dismounted his motorcycle and removed his helmet, the uniformed security guard stationed at the entrance stiffened. The guard, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and an authoritative stance, scrutinized him with suspicion rather than recognition. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, stepping forward. "This is private property. May I ask what business you have here?" Keanu, unfazed by the questioning tone, responded with a calm nod. "Good evening. I live here. Just moved in recently. Apartment 502. The guard's expression didn't soften. Instead, he studied Keanu's face, then cast a dubious glance at his motorcycling elegant, vintage machine, but far from the ostentatious vehicles typically found in the driveways of the elite. "You live here?" the guard repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "Do you have any identification?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, surprised by the reaction but not offended. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet. "Of course. I also have the lease agreement in my bag if you need to see it." The guard took the ID, his brows furrowing as he read the name. He looked up, then down again, as if trying to reconcile the casual man in front of him with the name he held in his hands. "Keanu Reeves?" The skepticism in his voice was unmistakable. Keanu gave a slight chuckle, nodding. "That's me." Instead of handing the ID back, the guard's grip tightened. "Look, sir, I don't know what kind of joke this is, but you're not listed in the system. And no one told me a new resident was moving into 502. Keanu remained composed, but a flicker of frustration crossed his face. He had anticipated a quiet evening, a simple ride home after a long day, but now he found himself in an unexpected standoff. "I understand security protocols," he said evenly. "I can wait while you check with management." The guard scoffed. "Management's not going to confirm someone who isn't registered." He folded his arms. "Honestly, you don't look like the type to live here. No offense." Keanu inhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. He had encountered all sorts of people in his life, some kind, some prejudiced, and some simply blinded by their own assumptions. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said firmly, locking eyes with the guard. A tense silence followed. The guard shifted uncomfortably, but his posture remained rigid. "Call whoever you need," Keanu continued. "I'll wait right here." The security guard hesitated, as if reluctant to make the call, but eventually reached for his radio. "Central, main gate. I've got a man here claiming to be the new resident of apartment 502. Says his name is Keanu Reeves. Can you check the system?" A crackle of static followed, then a muffled response. The guard's expression darkened. He shot Keanu a pointed look. "Just as I thought," he muttered. "There's no record of you." Keanu exhaled through his nose, gripping his helmet a little tighter. "That's likely a system error. I have the necessary documents to prove my residency." The guard shook his head. "I've been here for years. Never had anyone accidentally missing from the system." He gestured toward the street. "I suggest you check your address again, because you're not getting in." Keanu pressed his lips together, his patience tested but not broken. He had dealt with far worse situations in his life. "Listen," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't want to escalate this, but I do live here, and I'm not leaving until this is cleared up." The guard's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll be waiting a long time." What happened next would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. The night deepened, and the warm hues of the sunset gave way to the cool embrace of twilight. Keanu remained beside his motorcycle, his posture relaxed but unwavering, while the security guard paced impatiently. "I don't have all night for this," the guard muttered, shaking his head. "You say you live here, but you have no proof in the system, and frankly, you don't look like someone who—" He caught himself, hesitating before finishing the sentence. Keanu noticed the pause. He had heard that hesitation before, the kind that masked judgment, the kind that revealed more than words ever could. "Someone who what?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but pointed. The guard straightened his back. "Look, this place is exclusive. High-profile residents, they don't just let anyone in." Keanu exhaled slowly. And what does anyone mean exactly? The guard shrugged, waving toward Keanu's motorcycle. Come on, a guy on a bike like that, showing up in jeans and a leather jacket, doesn't exactly scream luxury resident, does it? Keanu bit the inside of his cheek, suppressing the urge to smirk. He had spent decades in Hollywood, working with people who measured status by the cars they drove and the designer clothes they wore, but he had never been interested in those things. Interesting, he finally said. So you're saying I don't belong here because I don't fit your idea of wealth? The guard's expression hardened. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, Keanu replied simply. For a moment, the guard was silent, as if realizing he'd been caught revealing more than he intended. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. Listen, I don't make the rules, he said, crossing his arms. I enforce them. And as far as I'm concerned, if your name isn't in the system, you're not getting through that gate. Keanu sighed, reaching for the strap of his motorcycle bag. Fine, he said, unzipping it. If you won't take my word for it, maybe you'll take something more official. From the bag, he pulled out a neatly folded stack of documents: lease agreement, proof of ownership, all legally binding. He handed them to the guard, who hesitated before taking them, glancing skeptically at the pages. Here are the purchase documents, Keanu said, his voice steady. Take your time. The guard flipped through the papers, his brows furrowing deeper with every page. He muttered something under his breath before finally looking back at Keanu. These could be fake, he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had before. Keanu let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Do you really think I went through the trouble of forging property documents just to sneak into a place I already own? The guard didn't answer. Instead, he pressed the radio on his shoulder again. Central, it's me. Can you get a hold of the administrator? We need confirmation on something. Static. Then a brief reply. The administrator is unavailable right now. Try later. The guard clicked his tongue in irritation and turned back to Keanu. Well, looks like we're at a standstill, he said smugly. Until I get confirmation, you're not getting in. Keanu exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers against his helmet. He could feel the weight of this ridiculous situation pressing down on him. He had no intention of leaving. Fine, he said. I'll wait. The guard blinked. Wait? For how long? As long as it takes. The guard let out a dry laugh. Suit yourself, he said, stepping back into his booth. But I hope you like standing. Keanu leaned against his bike, his arms crossed over his chest. He had spent his life training for patience in film sets, in stunt rehearsals, in the unpredictable chaos of the entertainment industry. If there was one thing he could do, it was wait. Minutes passed. Then half an hour. A few residents arrived, their luxury cars rolling smoothly past the gate with nothing more than a wave from the guard. Some threw curious glances in Keanu's direction, but no one stopped to ask why the man standing there looked so familiar. The air grew colder, but Keanu remained still, unmoving. The guard, now visibly irritated, occasionally glanced at him through the booth window, muttering under his breath. Then, flashing lights appeared in the distance. A police cruiser. Keanu didn't react. He had expected this. The security guard straightened his posture, suddenly looking more authoritative, as if the arrival of the police validated his actions. As the cruiser pulled up to the gate, two officers stepped out, one middle-aged, with a serious expression, the other younger and more relaxed. They surveyed the scene before turning to the guard. You called us? The older officer asked. The guard nodded and immediately launched into his version of events. Yeah, this guy's been standing here for almost an hour. Claims he's a resident, but he's not in the system. I asked him to leave, but he refused. He's being uncooperative. The older officer turned to Keanu, taking in his calm demeanor, his unshaken stance, and the fact that he was simply standing beside his own motorcycle. Sir, the officer said, his voice neutral. Can you tell us your side? Keanu nodded. My name is Keanu Reeves. I recently moved into apartment 502. There's been a mistake in the system, and the security guard won't let me in, despite me showing proof of ownership. The officer's brows lifted slightly at the name but remained professional. You have proof? Keanu reached into his bag again, pulling out the documents. Right here. The officer took the papers and began scanning them while his partner peered over his shoulder. The guard, meanwhile, stood rigid, arms crossed, watching with a smug expression. The younger officer whispered something to his partner. The older one exhaled sharply. "Well," he said, flipping to the last page, "everything checks out." Keanu said nothing. He didn't need to. The older officer turned to the security guard, his expression unreadable. "Looks like he's telling the truth." The smugness on the guard's face evaporated instantly. "Wait, what?" The officer handed the documents back to Keanu before looking at the guard again, this time with a more pointed expression. "Did you even bother to verify these before you called us?" The guard's mouth opened, then closed. His confidence was crumbling. "Well, you thought." "You thought," the officer repeated, his voice sharper now. "Or you assumed." The younger officer stepped forward, shaking his head. "This could have been handled in 5 minutes. Instead, you wasted everyone's time over what exactly? A gut feeling?" The guard swallowed, his eyes darting toward Keanu. But the actor's expression remained unreadable. Keanu could have said something then, could have thrown back a comment, could have let his irritation show, but he didn't. Because he knew the night wasn't over yet. And when the truth was finally revealed, it would leave everyone speechless. The silence that followed the officer's words was thick with tension. The security guard, who had spent the last hour holding firm in his decision, now looked visibly shaken. His authority, once so absolute, was crumbling before him. "Wait," the guard stammered, his voice weaker than before. "You're seriously telling me he's actually supposed to be here?" The older officer exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. The documents are real, the lease is valid, and Mr. Reeves is in fact a resident here." Keanu remained silent, simply observing the exchange. He had nothing more to prove. The younger officer, who had been studying the interaction closely, took a step closer to the guard. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his tone calm but sharp. "You called the police on a man who had all the proper documentation just because he didn't look like someone who should live here?" The security guard's face turned red. "That's not, I was just following protocol." The older officer shook his head. "No, you weren't. You were making assumptions. That's the problem." Keanu finally spoke, his voice even. "I don't blame you for doing your job, but I do blame you for the way you handled this." The guard flinched at Keanu's words, but before he could respond, a new voice entered the scene. "What the hell is going on here?" A man in a sharp suit approached from the direction of the condominium entrance, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. Keanu immediately recognized him, the building administrator. The guard visibly perked up, as if expecting support. "Sir, I was just doing my job. This man claimed he lived here, but he wasn't in the system, so I—" The administrator's expression changed the moment his eyes landed on Keanu. His face paled, then turned a shade of embarrassed red. "Oh my God," the administrator breathed. "Mr. Reeves." The security guard blinked, looking between Keanu and the administrator. "Wait, you know him?" The administrator looked as though he wanted to sink into the ground. "Of course I know him. We've been expecting him for weeks." The guard's face twisted in confusion. But the system didn't show." The administrator shot him a sharp glare. "That's because we had an issue updating the database. I sent an email to the security team days ago about Mr. Reeves' arrival." He turned to the officers, his voice hurried. "I deeply apologize for this. I had no idea there was an issue at the gate." The older officer let out a small sigh and glanced at Keanu. "Seems like a lot of unnecessary trouble over a simple system error." Keanu offered a small, knowing smile. "It happens." But even as he said it, he knew this situation wasn't just about a system error. The real issue ran much deeper than that. The administrator turned back to the security guard, his tone firm. "I'm going to have a very serious conversation with you about this later. Right now, open the gate." The guard, still looking shell-shocked, hesitated for a moment before finally, reluctantly pressing the button. With a quiet hum, the massive iron gate slid open. Keanu stepped forward, swinging a leg over his motorcycle and starting the engine with a low, smooth growl. The administrator stepped closer, his voice tinged with regret. "Mr. Reeves, I can't apologize enough for this mess. Please, let me know if there's anything we can do to make it up to you." Keanu looked at him for a moment before shaking his head. "Just make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." The administrator swallowed hard and nodded. "Of course." Keanu revved the engine lightly and rolled forward, passing through the now open gates. But just before he disappeared into the well-lit pathways of the condominium, he cast one last glance at the security guard. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just quiet understanding and maybe, just maybe, a hint of disappointment. And as Keanu rode off toward his new home, the security guard was left standing in the cold night air, confronted by the weight of his own actions. Keanu rode slowly through the pristine streets of the condominium, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The night was quiet, but the events at the gate lingered in his mind. This wasn't the first time he had been misjudged, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But what bothered him wasn't just the way he had been treated, was the thought of how many others had faced the same kind of prejudice without the recognition or influence to challenge it. By the time he reached the underground parking garage, Keanu had already decided he wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. As he parked his motorcycle, the administrator jogged up behind him, still visibly shaken from what had just transpired. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice careful, "if you'd be open to it, I'd like to arrange a meeting with the security team and some of the staff tomorrow. I want to make sure this never happens again." Keanu studied him for a moment. He appreciated the effort, but he also knew that one meeting wouldn't change years of ingrained bias. Still, it was a start. "I'll be there," Keanu replied, "but I want more than an apology. I want to make sure your team understands why this kind of judgment is dangerous." The administrator nodded quickly. "Absolutely. And I'll make sure the security guard from tonight is there too. He needs to hear this firsthand." Keanu simply gave a small nod before turning toward the elevator. He was exhausted, but he knew this conversation needed to happen. The next day, the meeting was held in the condominium's main hall. A handful of staff members were present: security guards, front desk personnel, even a few residents who had heard about the incident. The guard from the night before sat stiffly in a chair, his face carefully neutral, though his fingers fidgeted slightly against the table. He avoided looking at Keanu. The administrator opened the meeting with an official statement, apologizing for the previous night's events and acknowledging that their security protocols needed improvement. But then, he turned to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, if you'd like to say a few words, I think it would be valuable for everyone here." Keanu stood up, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair as he addressed the room. "I'm not here for an apology," he started, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here because what happened last night wasn't just about a system error. It was about an assumption of belief that I didn't belong simply because of how I looked, what I wore, or how I arrived." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, watching as some of the security staff shifted uncomfortably. "I know I had the privilege of being recognized," he continued, "and because of that, this situation was resolved in my favor. But what about the people who don't have that? What happens to the delivery driver who gets questioned too aggressively? The friend of a resident who gets turned away unfairly? The person who doesn't fit your idea of wealth?" The room was silent. Even the security guard from the night before was looking at the floor now, his jaw tight. Keanu exhaled slowly. "I get it," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You have a job to do. You want to keep this place safe. But security isn't just about keeping people out. It's about knowing who you're letting in and why you're making those choices." He turned his gaze directly to the guard. "I hope next time you think before you judge someone." The guard swallowed hard, his face pale. For the first time, he lifted his eyes to meet Keanu's. "I was wrong," the guard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my own biases get in the way of my job, and I'm sorry." Keanu gave a small nod. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." The administrator, looking humbled, turned to his staff. "From today forward, we'll be implementing new training for all security personnel and staff. We'll be focusing on fair treatment, better verification procedures, and ensuring that we don't judge people based on appearances." A few staff members nodded, some looking thoughtful, others simply relieved that this was being addressed. The meeting ended soon after, but its impact lingered. As Keanu made his way back to his apartment, one of the residents who had attended the meeting approached him in the hallway. "That was really something," the man said, offering a small smile. "Most people would have just let it go, but you actually took the time to make a difference." Keanu gave a small shrug. "If we don't speak up, nothing changes." The man chuckled. "Well, I think you just made a lot of people think twice about their assumptions." Keanu smiled, then unlocked his door. That's the goal. As he stepped inside, finally able to relax, he let out a slow breath. Maybe the night before had been frustrating. Maybe it had been exhausting. But if it meant even one person reconsidered their biases, then it was worth it. And with that, Keanu closed the door behind him, leaving the world outside just a little bit better than it had been the day before.